Welcome to episode 43 of the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about censorship and Banned Books Week. As many of you know, Banned Books Week occurs every year at the end of September to celebrate and defend great works of literature and other texts, other forms of entertainment and education that have been challenged or banned in public school and public library settings. Now, this year marks a special Banned Books Week because for the first time in my professional career, my 15th year as a public school teacher, I am going to be directly dealing with the effects of censorship in my classroom. Now, I'm going to actually start, instead of talking about the books, I'm going to address the broader issue of censorship, professionalism, and maybe use a term like safetyism in public schools today. Before we get into any of the specific issues, I'd like to make a couple of quick clarifications and declarations. First, in this podcast, I will be addressing issues of racism and use of racial slurs. However, I will not be using those racial slurs. At no point in this discussion am I trying to defend the negligent or hateful use of racial slurs or any other harmful or hateful language. That being said, this is a discussion about censorship and why we need to be cautious about making outright, absolute, universal bans on any word or idea in an educational setting, because those acts, in my belief, end up being regressive and counterproductive. I have featured a unit, and what started as a 3-week unit many years ago has sort of turned into a marking period and a half ongoing unit structure that focuses on concepts that we now would call antiracism. Unfortunately, just as we're getting into the 2020 school year, a school year in which more teachers across the United States are addressing concepts of race and promoting anti-racist ideas, just as we're hitting the point where this idea is sort of reaching a mass capacity, a serious movement, so to speak, I'm going to really struggle to address these concepts in my class. And so after having taught some of these ideas and some of these texts for 12, maybe 13 years, I'm going to hit a point where I'm really not sure what to do. So I guess I'll just sort of tell this in story form, and I apologize if it's a little disjointed, but what I essentially want to do is talk through some changes that have gone on or that are about to occur in my school division in Loudoun County Public Schools in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. I usually in these episodes don't refer directly to the name of my school or to the name of the county, though I do occasionally make references, and sometimes the people I'm talking to will. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and mention it because the example that I'm going to use is specific to that division, and because it might be the last time I get to talk about my own school division. So first, I'm going to start off with the idea of censorship just in terms of teachers' First Amendment rights. The Loudoun County Public Schools School Board and Upper Administration are in the process of finalizing and soon approving a new professional conduct policy. This is likely to be passed in mid-October, and the current language includes a lot of things that are very good about sexual harassment, about appropriate relationships with students, avoiding any forms of racial, ethnic, sexist bias, etc., etc. The vast majority of the ideas in this document are good, and the goals of the document, I think, are good. However, there is some troubling language, and I'm going to actually start at a place that's actually a little bit removed from the idea of banned books, but that still hits on censorship. This will also help you understand why I'm going to be cautious about referring to my own employer in the future. Section E of the document says, protected speech. Nothing in this policy or any other policy shall be interpreted as abridging an employee's First Amendment right to engage in protected speech. However, based upon an individualized inquiry, speech including but not limited to via social media on matters of public concern may be outweighed by the school division's interest in the following. 1. Maintaining efficiency of the school system. Sure, that's fine. 2. Preventing disruption or reasonable apprehension of a disruption of the learning and working environment. Sure, don't upset people and tell them that the sky is falling. Make sure that things keep running. Fine. Number 3, maintaining public trust and confidence at all times. That starts to sound like our goal here is to protect the system rather than to protect students and to promote education, but in a broad sense, it's probably still fine. Number 4, fostering close personal relationships among and between staff and parents. Well, that sounds wonderful. Don't write angry things that upset the parents, don't insult people online, etc. That's fine. Number 5, promoting internal LCPS and external community harmony and peace. I don't know how you do any of that. It's a little kumbaya, but again, as an idea, it's fine. But if this means that you can't levy any criticism against your employer or a coworker who says or does something inappropriate, well, that seems like that would be a violation both of the goals of the school system to increase equity and the quality of education, as well as violating that employee's First Amendment rights. Number 7 in this section, achieving a consistent application of the board's and superintendent's stated mission, goals, policies, and directives, including protected class equity, racial equity, and the goal to root out systemic racism. So we're left in a strange place, because what if an employee speaks out in public or through social media about racism that they see occurring within the school system? Is that a violation of the policy? Because at that point, I would be supporting E7, saying I want to call out, root out, and end systemic racism. However, by saying that, I might also be creating some sort of disruption or apprehension within the work environment, and I might be creating problems with the public trust. We tell students that we want them to speak truth to power, to call out injustice and to fix it when they see it. However, this is a policy that leaves open the possibility that teachers should not speak out when they see problems. Now, the idea of systemic racism is both important and very real. And in my particular school system, I think, you can make the easy sort of logical case that because we're engaging in a long process of ongoing equity and anti-racist training, there is the assumption that we are part of the systemic racism that goes on in the community. Why else do you need to send thousands of employees through hours and hours and hours of equity training if the schools aren't part of the problem? So clearly the assumption is that some of the equity problems, some of the race problems going on in the community at least, and maybe in the broader society, are rooted in schools. That is a reasonable assumption, because if we aren't part of the problem, then we wouldn't need to spend hours and hours and hours in the training and have these discussions. So if we can accept that schools are part of the system and therefore part of systemic racism, then it would be important for teachers as well as students and parents to speak out on these issues and try to improve them. Okay. And that's an important part of what we're going to try to do here. A big concern of mine and many other teachers is that Section E of this policy does serve to infringe certain parts of teachers' First Amendment rights. Now, that doesn't mean you should be able to go on Facebook or Twitter and lambast your employer, make things up, exaggerate things, or anything else. But there's clearly the implication that violations of the First Amendment are possible. Consider that they say, quote again, "Nothing in this policy or any other policy shall be interpreted as abridging an employee's First Amendment right to engage in protected speech. However," it's when you say, "No offense, but," and then you immediately say something offensive. "I don't mean to be racist, but," and then you immediately say something racist. Like that's exactly what that sentence structure tells me. So there's the clear understanding by the people writing and who will eventually be passing this policy, that this can potentially limit or infringe upon an employee's First Amendment right. So saying that we don't intend to do it doesn't mean that you're not going to do it. Now, let's talk about intent, okay? Because this is what's going to bring us back to my concerns and questions about censorship in the classroom and how we can hold effective classroom discussions while eliminating or not accessing a wide variety of effective and time-tested texts. So in another portion of the same policy, it's section B2, section B2, there is a universal ban on the use of racial slurs, which, without any sort of additional thought, sounds ideal, right? I would fully support that. I don't want students using racial slurs or really any offensive or angry language against each other. Certainly don't want teachers using that language either. However, when we think about what a universal and absolute ban means, we may need to reassess parts of this. So I'll read the policy, section B2. Use of racial insults or slurs regardless of intent. Those are banned. And it then throws in an example. For example, it is unacceptable to use a racial insult or slur in responding to or addressing a situation in which an individual has used a racial insult or slur. This means that a teacher could not quote a student to explain to that student why what they said is wrong. That's fine. We can use a substitution. We can use an abbreviation. But, let's be honest. If I say N-word, everybody knows exactly what I mean, right? So the idea that I'm trying to be conscientious, courteous, and respectful by not saying the word itself doesn't mean that we don't understand what we're talking about. It doesn't remove the word from existence or take any real power away from it. In fact, avoiding the word probably lends power to it. That being said, I'm all for being respectful and avoiding racial insults. But when we say regardless of intent, use of racial insults or slurs regardless of intent, that creates an interesting situation when we consider how many important texts in American society, in American culture and history, particularly texts by acclaimed Black authors, include racial slurs. I'm going to now quote from an article published in a local newspaper, Loudoun Times-Mirror, in which they quote the superintendent of Loudoun County Public Schools, Dr. Eric Williams. He speaks out on, I believe, September 11th, 2020, about some unfortunate incidents in virtual learning in which students sort of Zoom bombed. They got into classrooms they didn't belong in and used offensive language, racial slurs, or shared pornographic images and things like that. I think most of these things are probably intended as pranks, but they are, poorly performed and probably not demonstrative of the kind of maturity or intelligence that we would expect from our students, particularly at the high school level. That being said, this was the superintendent's response. Blah, blah, blah. He later added LCPS, quote, will not tolerate, end quote, use of any racial slurs in a school environment, even when meant as a term of endearment. So we're now blocking any use of the term, including what students will call the ending with the soft A or the sound, right, that you might get as a term of endearment, or when quoting, say, song lyrics, a movie, something like that. The article continues. A few days earlier, the Loudoun County School Board unanimously passed the school system's multi-year comprehensive equity plan, which includes a comprehensive ban on the use of the N-word by students and staffers. Now, again, I am not making the argument that people should be able to use offensive racial language whenever they feel like it, or even probably use it almost none. Right. That is essentially what I'm saying here, is not to promote the use of or even allow for the use of, except that making the universal ban essentially makes a lot of great texts unusable. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this back to texts that I've used in my English class, generally at the 11th grade level for many years with great success. I originally, when teaching 11th grade honors literature-based class, I built a unit around the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We read the book through the lens of it being an anti-racist text that follows the adventures of a young white boy trying to escape from an abusive, oppressive society. His abusive, alcoholic father, who essentially is beating him nearly to the point of death, and then also running from the rest of the town that both allows him to stay with that father, but also tries to impose a lot of rules on him. As he's running away, he meets up with Jim, a runaway slave who's also trying to escape from this oppressive and abusive society. The two of them leave together, they make friends, right? And as the story goes on, we see that Huck, who originally is shocked that Jim would run away, ultimately finds himself doing a lot of things and violating what he thought was the right thing to do, what everyone in his town told him was the right thing to do, in the name of helping Jim. As we go through the book, one of the primary questions is, will Huck ultimately save Jim? Will Jim be free? Right? Now, the book has its problems. It's not a perfect book, and there are obvious problems in the language. The N-word appears 219 times in the text. Every time I've taught the book, I do a little 5 to 10 minute discussion of how we can handle this and what students can or should do if they find the book offensive or they do not want to participate in the discussions. I've always offered an alternative, and in, I believe, 11 or 12 years of using the book, I have had a few discussions with individual students about their comfort level with the book. I don't believe I've ever had a student opt out. And that's not for any bullying. I'd be happy to give the alternative. Students choose to participate, and generally speaking, that unit tends to go well. Now, in recent years, I've started to pair the book with other important American texts, classical American texts, that would support understanding of American culture, as well as racism that is an important part of our culture. The systemic racism that exists today is built on a long and very strong foundation that's been around for hundreds of years. So a few years ago, as I began teaching AP language, English language, and composition, I added in the narrative of Frederick Douglass. So now we introduce the concept of racism, and students read the narrative of Frederick Douglass, which itself includes not only many uses of the N-word, it also includes direct instances of racial violence. There are scenes in which he vividly describes black slaves being whipped, being tortured. He references, though does not graphically describe, the rape of slaves. He talks about getting into fistfights with slave owners who use racist language against him. Now, I point this out because for most people, the most offensive part of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is the use of the N-word. In the narrative of Frederick Douglass, a nonfiction account of his early life, not only do we have the instances of the N-word, but it is paired with graphic violence and a lot of hatred. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's probably safe to say that around half, maybe over half, of the uses of the N-word in the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are not actually intended with malice. It's just sort of the word they used at the time, right? That doesn't excuse it, and that doesn't mean that students in class should ever use the word casually. That's certainly not the point. However, you say 219, we go, my Lord, that's terrible. Of course we don't want to read this. But if you put the book into its context, published in 1884, set in the 1830s or 1840s, then that word was just kind of a regular word at the time. As proof of that, let's go back to the narrative of Frederick Douglass, in which Frederick Douglass uses the N-word without any hesitation and no censorship. However, when he uses words that we now consider far less offensive, like damned or bitch or similar words, again, words we don't want to throw around casually, but words that we also on average are not, as offended by. I don't think anybody would say they're as offended by those words as they are by the N-word. Now, what Frederick Douglass does is he substitutes in, I believe, an asterisk, he puts a symbol in for the vowels in the middle of those words because he thought they were improper to print and perhaps was worried about some of the decency laws in existence when he wrote and published his early memoir, his slave narrative. That alone is the indication of how people felt about the word at the time. Now, of course, our sensibilities have changed. However, judging a text outside of the context in which it's created is unfair and unreasonable. I say it's unfair and unreasonable because that means that we miss the purpose of the text. Okay, so I'm going to bring this back to The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is one of the first truly anti-racist books written in the United States of America. Now, some people say, how can you say that? Jim's treated poorly. Jim's character flattens out at points. He doesn't have the depth. They put Huck at the center of the story, et cetera, et cetera. Again, the book is sort of representative of its time. However, it would be unreasonable to read the book and think that it is a promotion of racism or slavery. If that is your viewpoint on the book, I don't mean this offensively to anyone who holds that view, but I would strongly argue that you should read the book again and read it through the lens of Mark Twain, a man who himself believed very strongly that racism was a problem in American society and wanted to do something about it. Okay? The book is all about moral development and about how these characters can gain their freedom. At the end of the book, if you read it carefully, there is no doubt that the most moral, the most admirable character in the book is Jim. Jim is the person that we should all be looking up to. And in case we need, further evidence of that from a literary, standpoint, consider that Huck's father, Pap Finn, one of the most detestable characters in American literary history, like in all of the canon, he's one of the most disgusting people you can imagine, and also the person who's responsible for the most angry and racist statement in the book. His real name is Jim. They serve as foils. Huck's real father, a white man, is detestable. But the guy who he ultimately learns a lot from, learns a lot about morals, learns a lot about racism, learns a lot about what it means to be an independent, free person, well, that's Jim. They have the same name. They both play fatherly roles. There is no doubt that Jim is the best person in this book. And unfortunately, I think people miss that point sometimes. Some people say, well, Twain, to write a book like that, he must have been racist. He must have thought, terrible things about black people, et cetera, et cetera. But that itself is blatantly untrue. He went on record many different times in his life and said that essentially the book, said that, slavery was terrible and that racism was something that we needed to do away with. In maybe a little known anecdote, but maybe is useful in at least partial defense of Mark Twain himself. He writes the book not as opposition to slavery, but as opposition to racism. Okay, the book's published in 1884. The slavery issue, at least in a large scale and sort of formal way, is done. We continue to have peonage and slavery in the United States until World War II, and you could argue all the way through to today in the form of convict leasing. However, the large scale sort of mass slavery and plantation sort of vision we have of antebellum slavery was done and settled by 1884. The book is not arguing against slavery. The book is arguing against racism. That's why we still have to explore the issues of Jim's freedom and independence, of Jim's treatment, of why Jim is a better person than all the other people in the book. Okay, the book is meant to oppose racism. In fact, in Mark Twain's own life, he said, I forget the exact context of this, but I do have the quote. He said on the topic of black students entering prestigious universities, within a year, I think, year or two after Huckleberry Finn being published, he said, "I do not believe I would very cheerfully help a white student who would ask as a benevolence of a stranger, but I do not feel so about the other color. We have ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." Twain went on to pay the full tuition and costs at Yale Law School for Warner T. McGuinn, one of the first black students at the school, and later a lawyer who received high praise from Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and many others. Twain believed that racism was wrong. Not just that slavery was wrong, but racism was wrong. And he believed that white people owed reparations, owed something to black people in this country. This is not a man who wrote the book with the intention of disparaging Jim or any other black people in the country. That is a misreading of the book. Now, what do we do when people lose that understanding? Well, we end up with something that maybe happens in a lot of classrooms. We try to censor. Okay. And many teachers will, just avoid the word. And that's generally actually what I do. Okay. For anyone who's thinking like, well, how does this guy teach the book? Are we just, reading every page out loud and yelling the N-word when it happened? No. And in fact, I do the best I can to avoid that word unless it's a necessary part of that discussion. And so, students are never asked to read aloud unless they choose to do so in small groups. Students are encouraged to say N-word or a reasonable substitution. But I also would never tell someone that they're wrong for quoting from the book. And so, we end up in this weird situation, though, where some people are so uncomfortable, and for good reason, are so uncomfortable with the language that we censor the book altogether. So one professor, Dr. Alan Gribben, revised and republished The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn through a company called New South Publishing. This happened a few years back. I want to say maybe 2012, 2014. I'll link an article about that on the ClassCastPodcast.com post for this episode. Okay, and what he essentially did was he went out to replace every instance of the N-word with the word slave. He said that he was doing that he was making the change to reduce teachers' and students' discomfort with the text and in class discussions. The problem is it renders the book colorblind. This is a book about racism, not a book about slavery. And so to make that change makes a significant change to the focus of the book. It makes it sound like every part of this is opposition to slavery. But remember, the book was published almost 20 years after slavery was formally ended. Right? So that's a misunderstanding. It also forces some people to conflate the ideas of slavery and racism. It's important to point out that the vast majority of black people who have ever existed on the planet have not been slaves. It's also worth pointing out that the vast majority of humans who have been enslaved have not been black people. So yes, while in the United States, that is our context, and that's a reasonable way to interpret the idea of slavery in most discussions. It's not actually accurate to consider that those terms are always going to be interchangeable. That's a misunderstanding of issues, and more importantly, a misunderstanding of the book. Now, what's all of this about? Well, if we go back and we think about the changes coming in the conduct policy, which I told you about earlier, and the universal ban on the N-word, and me as a teacher who's worked very hard to make anti-racism a core component of his class for 11 or 12 years, then I sort of saw the writing on the wall. I thought, I might have to handle these things differently this year than I have in recent years, maybe ever before. So early in the school year, a few weeks ago, I sent emails to a few of my supervisors, administrators, etc., and basically just said, so what's the deal? Like, what do you recommend I do with these books I teach? And by the way, I forgot to mention that in recent years, I've also started pairing excerpts from the Autobiography of Malcolm X. So students actually read the narrative of Frederick Douglass. We layer in some articles, mostly biology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, a little bit of psychology and sociology to really understand what race is in a biological sense. It's made up in the human race. And then how it functions in our society. It's a man-made construct meant to divide people, categorize them, and to distribute power and opportunity to some while, deprive others of that. So we learn all these things, students, we read through the articles, students talk in small groups, this whole class, they do some writing, reflection. There's a lot of work here. And after finishing Frederick Douglass, they read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Now, as we get into the second half of Huckleberry Finn, sometimes I scattered in earlier, students read excerpts from the Autobiography of Malcolm X, which again includes several racial slurs and incidents of racial violence. It's widely suspected that Malcolm X's father was killed for racist reasons. His house was burned down when he was growing up. One of the most powerful sections of the book, particularly in the early sections of the book, is when his favorite teacher, an English teacher, asks students what they want to be when they grow up. Young Malcolm says, "I want to be a lawyer." And the teacher uses a racial slur and tells him that that's no kind of job for a black person, and that he should maybe think about being a carpenter or something like that. Now, if you know anything about Malcolm X, if you ever heard him speak or read any of his work, there is no doubt that Malcolm X would have been an incredible lawyer, right? So I use that to point out that Malcolm X in the 1950s and 60s is facing the same problems that Frederick Douglass was facing, that Jim was facing, except for the formal removal of slavery. We then extend it and have a discussion about what does racism look like in the United States today. I ask them who would be the next voice we could cite to indicate how much or how little progress has been made. Because if Frederick Douglass, if his experience and Jim's experience are so very similar to Malcolm X's, just separated by formal slavery and then, formal segregation, I said, what would that look like today? We have a long, ongoing discussion about these issues. However, when you make a universal ban on any use of that word in the school, then those books are no longer safe for class. Right. I use the phrase, it's like playing hot potato with a hand grenade. Okay. To hand students books that are full of words that they can look at on the page but can't read aloud is essentially asking for trouble. Okay. Now, I've never told students that they can't say the word out loud. I just explained to them why that would generally be inappropriate and we should avoid it. And we've never actually had a problem. In 12 years of using these texts, only once have I ever had a student use the N-word inappropriately in class. And it was actually a student who English was his second, actually I believe it was his third language. And he literally did not understand the context and sort of the significance of the word. And so as he was speaking, classmates sort of in shock when I explained, pulled him aside, explained what was going on and why what he said was offensive. I've never seen someone more apologetic or embarrassed. And certainly we didn't want him to be embarrassed. We just it's a teachable moment. We want you to learn. So in 12 years with hundreds of students working through these texts, I have never actually had a problem. I've never had a parent complain. But given the upcoming changes in the employee professional conduct policy, I thought maybe I should reach out and ask. And so after a few days and some deliberation, people sort of sent the question up the flagpole, back down. Everybody talked about it. And as it turns out, there were actually a lot of discussions behind the scenes about it. And the message I was given essentially was that I should under no circumstances teach Huckleberry Finn. And if I chose to this year, I would have no administrative support and I would have no backup on it because it was essentially indefensible. I was told that the book sort of acts as a lightning rod and that might attract a lot of negative attention from the community and that essentially no one would be able to defend that. I understand the book's a lightning rod. It's one of the most commonly challenged books in the country. This is when Banned Books Week and, academic censorship starts to be a part of this discussion. I understand those challenges and where they've come from. I also would point out to people that a lot of those challenges, particularly in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s against Huckleberry Finn, those were not because people were offended by the N-word. A lot of those challenges came from racist groups and very sort of fundamentalist conservative groups in the South who saw the anti-racist message in the book and didn't want young people reading it. And that's, you can look this up. This is literally true, that a lot of the early challenges and the mid-century challenges against Huckleberry Finn came from people who opposed the book because it was too anti-racist. It's only in the last, say, 30 to 40 years that more of the challenges have come because of the word itself. So I understand why someone would say it's a lightning rod. However, I have a lot of trouble understanding why someone would say we cannot defend that. For a little context, my employer, Loudoun County Public Schools, just last year in I believe the fall of 2019, spent thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, a lot of money purchasing what they call diverse classroom libraries. Every English teacher in the county, elementary, middle, and high school, received a classroom library of 250 books, all of which were written by authors of color or females, LGBTQ, etc., or who featured main characters who fell into one of these underrepresented categories as well. Now, as an idea, it's a good thing, right? We even with broadening the canon since the 1990s, the American literary canon, even the traditional European literary canon, tends to be overwhelmingly white and male. So I have no problems with broadening opportunities to read books by or about different people with different world experiences and views. The problem here is that a significant number of people showed up to speak at school board meetings last fall in which they objected to some of those books being placed in some of those classrooms. Now, I opposed most of those complaints on the grounds that I oppose censorship. Okay, but there were books in, I believe, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade classrooms that not only talked about transgender people, which is probably fine, but talked about gender reassignment surgeries that talked in relative detail. Now, again, I don't think that we should just ban that book. I don't think that should be censored. I do think that that's the kind of thing, though, that if you're going to have a young person read, one, probably want the parents to be on board with, and two, you probably want to make sure that the teacher's there to have a discussion with the student and guide them through it. Read the book, understand how people live, understand that different people have different experiences in the world. All of that is perfectly valid. Okay, but to just drop the books into the classroom and tell kids pick up, read whatever you want, I understand why parents are concerned. Okay, there were books in which there was sexual abuse. There were books in which there were sexual or romantic relationships between minors and adults. There are a lot of questionable things here. Again, I don't think we should ban any of the books, and I don't necessarily judge anyone who wants to read it or wants to share that literature. That's fine. My concern with this is that when dozens upon dozens upon dozens, hundreds of people in the community either spoke at school board meetings or contacted their school board reps, called the superintendent, and explained why they thought it would be offensive or inappropriate for those books to be present in their children's classrooms, the school administration essentially said that it was important to provide access to diverse literature, that all different people should be able to read about all different kinds of things, and that if your child doesn't want to read it, or if you don't want your kid to read it, don't read it and choose something else, right? That's fine. That's a perfect response. No one should be forced to read something that violates their personal comfort or their personal morals. That's fine. However, we also shouldn't tell them that they are not allowed to have access to it. And so less than 12 months after some of those school board meetings, I'm now in a situation where Huckleberry Finn, arguably one of the great American novels, is about to be formally removed from our reading lists because, and this is a quote that I was given, because the harm and trauma that it causes for students is not worth the potential educational gains. I'm not sure about that last word. Now, I've been holding off. Okay, I got some of this news earlier this week on the Monday, the first day of Banned Books Week. And to tell you that I was upset would be an understatement. To tell you that I was confused would be an understatement. I really had trouble wrapping my head around it, and so I was a combination of angry and confused, and I almost recorded a podcast that day and thought better of it. I said I need to give it a few days and think about this. I've also been waiting because I've been told that we're going to receive official guidance on how to handle books with controversial language, and also on what books would or wouldn't be approved for classroom use. However, given that it's Banned Books Week, and on the Monday of Banned Books Week, I received word that important books were going to be banned from our classrooms, I thought, well, I can't wait a week or two or three to say something because, well, we're literally sitting in Banned Books Week, and I'm for the first time dealing with a book being banned from my class. Okay? Now, when I had a conversation with an administrator about how to handle this, I was told, again, they could not or would not back me for teaching Huckleberry Finn. I was told, however, that the narrative of Frederick Douglass and the autobiography of Malcolm X would be acceptable, and that, while I should be cautious with the language, that I would have full support if I chose to teach those books. My question is, what's the difference? The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a work of fiction. The others are nonfiction. I don't think that's it. The author of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is white, and the other authors are black. That could be it, but I don't think that's it necessarily either. I really do think that we have people in positions of power in school systems who are right now going to make decisions about classic works from the American canon based solely upon the perception of public pressure. Again, I say the perception of public pressure because I've been using these books for 12 years and have never had any parent complaints or any serious objections from a student. In fact, when this conversation sort of got rolling, I reached out to a handful of former students to ask them. I said, look, after the fact, you can tell me I'm not grading your stuff anymore. You have no reason to lie to me. What do you think? And I asked a few black students who I think read the books well, who are paying attention. Like, these are informed opinions from thoughtful people, all of whom are going to excellent, very selective schools or Ivy League schools. And I did get 2 students who said that, they understood the purpose and they didn't object to it, but that Huckleberry Finn did make them uncomfortable. And I regret that. I don't like that. But part of the reading, part of the purpose of those discussions is to make people uncomfortable. The unfortunate part is that really the white students are the ones who, if anyone, those are the students who should probably feel uncomfortable, because when you understand the message of the book, you understand why the language is so powerful. The people who are supposed to feel awkward or guilty are the people who have inflicted the harm on others. And in, our country's history, that would be white people. So I did get a couple of those responses, and I think that's perfectly fair, and that's something I always need to be mindful of. But the overwhelming number of responses, and again, I asked, several students, not hundreds, but what I thought was a representative sample of students who would have read these books in high-level classes. And here are, 2 of the responses that I got. One from a student at a very selective university who's been very active in recent, activism and protests, and she said, and I'm just going to read her quote, I think that Huck Finn was a realistic reading that just highlighted how shitty racism is without trying to feign some uplifting ending. It's important to learn the reality of the situation, and it's obviously going to upset and embarrass white people. But boo-hoo. Imagine being black. I think the issue is Huck Finn doesn't have the fairy tale happy ending vibe that our Eurocentric education likes to push when it comes to racial matters. If it's the white students getting quote-unquote traumatized, then good. Maybe they'll learn to stop using the N-word at the very least. As for black students, unfortunately, it is important for us to learn about that history. But it's also important that there be a balance between us learning about anti-blackness and black excellence. Just something to think about. As for question 2, I understand that the situation is a bit scary. I referenced sort of this censorship in the classroom, and I basically asked advice, what should I do? Should I just get rid of the books, or what should I do? And she continues, for question 2, I understand that the situation is a bit scary. However, teachers didn't even face potential termination when they had racist scandals. So I really don't think anyone would actually fire a teacher who's being intentional and educative about racial matters. If you were put in that situation, you could easily make arguments that would make anyone look absolutely stupid and bigoted for trying to punish you. I don't think the county has the balls, her words, not mine, if you actually threaten to get the local NAACP involved, etc. It's important to continue teaching the truth, especially now that many people are realizing how whitewashed our education is. It's especially disgusting that our county would even consider these policies right after Trump made a whole speech about removing education about racism from schools. The timing is so political. Don't succumb to that bullshit. Civil disobedience. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Now, that's obviously the most strongly worded and blunt response I got. But here's a response from another student, another black young woman attending Ivy League school. And she said, personally, I didn't find Huckleberry Finn inappropriate for class, and it probably caused a lot more conversation than other texts would. I think rather than avoiding racial slurs, it could be a point of conversation on the history, use, and consequence of the words. I really don't think you should replace all the texts. I found Frederick Douglass to be super insightful, and I also like the Malcolm X unit. If it really becomes an issue, I think getting rid of Huck Finn and finding another book that fits the county's protocol could be better. I don't know if that was helpful at all. Let me know. And, it is helpful because there's the acknowledgement that Huckleberry Finn is the piece that's more easily replaced than the others. And I wouldn't necessarily deny that, but that's largely because in this context, we're talking about AP language and composition. So we're talking about nonfiction and historical fact from a black person's perspective, as opposed to a work of fiction written by a white person. And so I fully understand the difference there. However, I have trouble when an administrator says, I can back you on some texts but not on others, when the policy gives a universal ban on use of any racial language. So if I can read 2 books in class, have students, use it for discussion, write essays in which they quote the books, but somehow the other one is no longer acceptable, no one can actually tell me the difference. And that's sort of where I got really confused. I sort of expected that I was going to get an answer telling me that some books were okay and not others. I didn't think in the current climate with protests for social justice that anybody was actually going to tell me you cannot teach the narrative of Frederick Douglass. I, however, didn't expect anyone to say outright, you cannot teach Huckleberry Finn, but those other books are fine. Basically, be careful, but don't worry about it. Okay, now that is, it seems either illogical or misguided, or maybe fully hypocritical. I'm not sure, but it does not demonstrate a good knowledge of the text, nor does it indicate a good knowledge or logical approach to the issues. So when someone tells me I can support you on these books, but not on that book, when essentially the thing that is most offensive is the use of language that is common across the books, I have to assume I don't actually have backup. Right? I don't really have support because the support I've been offered is partial, it's conditional, and it is based upon what I believe to be a misunderstanding of the text and the issues themselves. Now, I'm not blaming, the individuals who I spoke with. I'm not quoting those people because I respect those individuals very much. And it's difficult for me to say how much of what what I was being told was their personal opinion versus, sort of the party line, so to speak. And so, that isn't meant as a criticism to, of the people who I've had these conversations with, so much as a concern about what we're doing in our schools if we're going to ban these classic works. Now, you notice I said works. You're saying, okay, well, what's that about? They said you could keep the other books. Well, in a subsequent meeting, we were told that if not this year, then next year, not only would Huckleberry Finn be removed from our reserved, reading list or recommended reading list, but that it was going to essentially be banned. You wouldn't be allowed to teach it. We also found out that Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck was going to be removed in the same way, and that To Kill a Mockingbird was going to be removed unless it was taught at the 9th grade level in tandem with Bryan Stevenson's sort of, what's becoming a modern classic, his nonfiction work, Just Mercy. Now, Just Mercy is a phenomenal book. Here's the issue. Just Mercy is probably a book that's best read later on in high school or maybe even early in college when students have a better understanding of the criminal justice system and have taken an American history class. However, To Kill a Mockingbird and that book are now being pushed into the 9th grade level. So you're essentially telling teachers, if you want to teach To Kill a Mockingbird and use that as a discussion piece in your classroom, you have to assign students 2 books, at least one of which, in terms of the knowledge of the world, sort of the age level content there, is probably a little bit beyond them. But that means that students would have to read 2 books to essentially have that same discussion. Now, I'm all for teaching Just Mercy. I'm actually considering it as a replacement for Huckleberry Finn. Unfortunately, it also includes several uses of the N-word, and if I am going to protect my own employment, my good standing with my employer, then I would be wise to avoid that word altogether. I want you to stop and think, especially for those of you who are well-read, if you're an English teacher or history teacher, think about how many texts generated by American authors or resulting from events in American history. Think about how many of those pieces would be off limits if the N-word is universally banned. It's serious, right? And again, I'm not saying that anybody needs to say that word in class. I'm just saying that when you say that regardless of intent, right, use of racial insults or slurs are banned regardless of intent, then that means it doesn't matter if I'm correcting a behavior or if I'm engaging in an educational activity. It doesn't matter how we use it, why we use it. If the word appears, the teacher and the students are in jeopardy. Why would I ever endanger my own career or my students' discipline records and their own sort of social well-being, right? We don't want anyone to be embarrassed or judged harshly, etc. Why would I ever put anyone in that situation if I know up front that this is going to be a problem? Now, a lot of this came about because I asked the question, and this maybe just serves, maybe the lesson here is, it's better to ask for forgiveness than, what is it? It's easier to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, something like that. But I wanted to be proactive, and I wanted to make sure that everyone, in my department, in my school, maybe throughout the county was on the same page and understanding what is a reasonable and responsible approach to using books with controversial and troublesome language, but that also have important themes that can help us to both understand our country and our culture, and also to understand how writers work, and maybe to, in a more specific sense, how anti-racism works. We're in a very weird place, and I really don't know how to move forward, because as much as I would like to continue using Huckleberry Finn, yeah, sure, I can toss it, I can replace it. I'm essentially based on the policy in the exact same hot water if I use Frederick Douglass, or if I use Malcolm X, or if I use Just Mercy, or if I use any of the dozens of other texts that set up for quality discussions about anti-racism, racism, American culture, and American history. The blanket ban on the word, regardless of intent, and the limitations on employees' first right amendments, both within and inside and outside of school, cause serious problem. I received all of this information on the Monday of Banned Books Week, and the person who is going to ultimately be responsible for making the decision and who's likely going to ban Huckleberry Finn, Of Mice and Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, and possibly others, that person sent out an email that included links to all kinds of NCTE materials, the National Council of Teachers of English, about Banned Books Week, which has been sponsored for years by the American Library Association, working in coordination with the National Council of Teachers of English, which is also, I don't know formally, but is at least in ideologically supported by the American Civil Liberties Union. Okay, and so I'm going to read a position statement that's titled, it's from July 31st, 2018, from NCTE. And this says, it's called Guidelines for Dealing with Censorship of Instructional Materials. I'm just going to read you the overview. Censorship has been a singular topic of concern and resistance for teachers in schools for generations. From protecting the textual choices of educators in classrooms to defending the languages and perspectives expressed by students, responding to censorship challenges requires vigilance and clear guidelines. Recognizing that the role of technology, production, and participatory culture allow texts to be created and interpreted in many different ways in schools today, this statement focuses on instructional materials broadly in its outline of how to deal with censorship. And then they go on to talk about the other kinds of materials they're going to include. They talk a lot about the First Amendment throughout the actual statement itself. They then go on in the third paragraph of the actual statement. NCTE says, unfortunately, the classroom study of print, non-print, and multimedia materials is often jeopardized by direct and indirect censorship. Direct censorship occurs when principals and school boards restrict the materials a teacher can and cannot use in the classroom. For instance, when teachers are told not to show films the Motion Picture Association of America has rated R. In fact, the courts have ruled that such ratings are not relevant to instructional purposes. The use of software filters on school and library computers to block student access to potentially offensive materials on the internet, as required by the Child Internet Protection Act, also represents an instance of direct censorship. While the Supreme Court has ruled that Congress is within its rights to mandate the use of filters as a condition of funding, research indicates that such devices often block access to quote-unquote protected and potentially valuable sites, are largely ineffective at protecting users from objectionable materials, and can easily be circumvented. When you try to prevent students from accessing questionable materials, you essentially just prevent their teachers from accessing quality materials that get caught up in those filters. Students will still access whatever of those materials they wish. And so that is where we're at here. Banning these books, removing them from the classroom, in no way makes the N-word not exist, and in no way takes away its power. I do not want my students using that word, but I also do not want my students lacking an historical or cultural context for how the words have gained their meanings, for how and why people in our country have the experiences they have, and for how and why they themselves might be able to contribute to fixing those problems. It will be incredibly difficult to foster that kind of discussion in an English class without a text to base the discussion on. Our job is to read, think, write, and speak. If we can't read about it, then it's very difficult for me to use it as a legitimate classroom discussion. And if I can't read texts that include racial slurs, then a lot of the classic texts and even some very good modern texts become problematic, right? Becomes a risk for me and for my students. And so while, no part of this podcast, this discussion is meant to request, a free run at using offensive language, I am asking people to consider what is the best way to end racism? What is the best way to end systemic racism? I would argue that it is to inform people, to let them understand and see the world as it is, to understand how people really think and act, to understand that the policy that is in place is either helping you or hurting you. There is no such thing as neutral policy. And if it turns out that we're looking at educational or political, economic policy, military policy, any kind of policy that is ultimately favoring one group of people over others or is disenfranchising another group, we need to be able to see it. We need to be able to talk about it. We need to be able to put it in context. And for students, for young people who are trying to learn about the world, we can give them two options. We can provide you access to that information. We can give you a place where you can have a thoughtful and interesting discussion using quality materials to better understand the world you live in, to better understand the issues you face, and then to talk about solutions. Or we can protect you from those controversial and difficult topics. We can say that you can only use certain texts and certain materials that may not set up the same discussion or may set up the same discussion with less fervor and intensity, or we can avoid it altogether. And I think we've been avoiding a lot of these things for far too long. I do understand that there are some things that are more or less appropriate for classroom use, but I do not think that banning texts outright is ever going to be the right thing to do. So as we sit here halfway through Banned Books Week in 2020, I am dealing with banned books and censorship for the first time in my professional career, and working in a county that is working very hard, at least on the surface, and maybe through its depths, to oppose and end inequity, particularly racial inequity in our system. I find it at least interesting and really kind of offensively regressive that we're going to limit people's ability to have these discussions or to use the text. Now, again, for anyone who says, but you can use the other books, but you can't. Okay, the policy on the use of language and the policy limiting teachers' expression says that if you use a text that has the word, you have created the potential for serious problems. If that's not the intent of the policy, then the policy needs to be rephrased and rewritten. Okay, and if no one wants to make a more thoughtful and more precise policy, then essentially teachers who continue to use these texts are going to be playing, hot potato with a hand grenade and risking their own sort of social status and maybe more importantly their career. And I just don't think that that's a reasonable or fair thing to do when the goal is to fight racism. So, what have I learned during Banned Books Week 2020? I've learned that people who a year ago said that they were going to stand up against censorship, that they opposed banning books, that they wanted students to have access to anything that they wanted to read that could enrich their world, enrich their lives, I've come to realize that that's not actually true, because you cannot defend one set of literature for students to access, regardless of how the community or their parents feel, and then turn around and ban other ones because they violate your own sensibilities. It wouldn't make sense to have all of those meetings and all of those fights about the other books and to say now that you're not willing to stand up in the same way. We believe in educational and intellectual freedom, or we don't. We believe in the use of the best available texts, in things that support education and enriching, thoughtful, purposeful discussions, or we don't. We believe in banning books, or we don't. And I can tell you that while I do understand there are some things that we need to be cautious about in the classroom, I don't think we're going to achieve any great progress or any significant improvements by banning the texts that have proven that they have the right intention and that they can set up the kind of discussions that will help students to learn about their world and ultimately to fix the problems that older generations have tolerated for far too long. This has been episode 43 of the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. And this will probably be the last time I get to speak directly about where I work or who I work with, because if this professional conduct policy is put in place, then any specific reference to my employer could potentially put me in danger, just as any use of the text I've just discussed. So I hope that my statement has been thoughtful. I hope it is well received, and I hope I've been clear that the goal here is one of anti-racism, of inclusion and equity, and that it's also maybe a lot about freedom, okay, and using freedom for productive ends. If you have questions or if you'd like to share a comment, I would love to hear your thoughts, both on the texts, on the policies, and on my positions on them. I am always open to changing my mind, and so if you feel that I'm somehow misinterpreting, misunderstanding, or missing a point, I would love to have additional information and perspectives that can help me to better understand the world I live in, or to better understand the ways I can serve my students in the classroom. You can reach me through the ClassCast Podcast website, classcastpodcast.com. There's a contact form. You can email readthinkWriteSpeak@yahoo.com. And you can also reach out through our social media platforms. It's ClassCast Podcast on Facebook, at ClassCast Podcast on Instagram, and at ClassCast Pod on Twitter. I hope you give it thought, and I would love to hear what some of the listeners are thinking about this, because I think we're going to have more of these discussions, not fewer, over the next few months and perhaps the next few years. Thank you for listening.